The night was heavy with incense and quiet terror. Somewhere deep within the labyrinth of Topkapi's stone corridors, a single candle trembled before the gilded lattice of a locked chamber. The air was perfumed with amber oil, musk, and something sharper, the scent of fear clinging to the silk veils that shrouded the women within. Behind those curtains, once sacred hands that had known only rosaries now shook as they clutched the folds of foreign garments. The faint murmurs of Arabic prayers bled through the walls, mingling with the desperate Latin whispers of women who no longer knew which god was listening. The empire outside slept in gold and glory, but inside this hidden room, faith itself was being dissected, piece by trembling piece. She had been called Sister Helena once. Now she was only Helene, a sound reshaped by foreign tongues, a name murmured by men who saw sanctity as challenge and purity as conquest. Her convent had been taken months ago, its bells melted into coins, its icons sold in the markets of Bursa, its altar torn down and replaced by a silken divan. When the soldiers came, they did not kill the sisters. Death would have been mercy. Instead, they brought them here to the palace that the world worshipped as paradise, but which every captive knew as a living tomb. From the marble courtyard outside, the call to prayer rose like smoke, echoing through the columns, a reminder that the Sultan's empire stretched from the Danube to Damascus and that within its heart even the holiest could be broken. Helena stared at the gilded lattice before her, and in its reflection she saw herself not as she had been, but as the empire wanted her to become, silent, perfumed, compliant, another relic repurposed for imperial pleasure. The candle guttered, its flame swallowing its own light, and for a moment the darkness seemed to breathe. This was not the story the chroniclers dared to write. This was the other Ottoman Empire, the one built not on marble and law, but on silence, submission, and a cruelty so deliberate it remade devotion into despair. Before we descend into the shadows of this forgotten truth, hit subscribe, because what you are about to hear is history stripped of mercy. To understand what awaited those Christian nuns within the veiled chambers of the Ottoman world, we must step into a century where empires consumed souls as easily as cities, and conquest was not measured merely in land, but in obedience. The 15th century dawned upon a fractured Christendom, weary from its own crusades and sins, as the crescent banners of the Ottomans rose higher each year above the smoking ruins of what had once been Byzantium. When the cannons of Mehmet II thundered against the Theodosian walls in 1453, it was not only a city that fell, but a civilization's illusion of divine protection. Constantinople, that shimmering heart of Orthodox faith, crumbled beneath iron and fire, and from its ashes emerged an empire that saw itself not as successor, but as judgment. The Ottomans believed themselves ordained to rule not by inheritance, but by divine conquest. Every fallen church was proof of heaven's favor, every silenced bell another hymn in the empire's praise. Where the Latin cross once rose, the crescent now gleamed in minarets that cut through the sky like blades, and beneath those towers, the conquered prayed not for salvation, but for permission to exist. The Sultan's architects built mosques from the bones of basilicas, and the marble that had once reflected candlelight before the icons of saints now bore the shadows of servants and slaves. Yet conquest was not merely a spectacle of war. It was a philosophy, a theology of control that reached into the soul of the defeated, shaping it until even the humiliated began to believe that submission was destiny. It was in this crucible of domination that the empire's most perverse experiment began. While chroniclers recorded the triumphs of sultans and viziers, another ledger was quietly kept within the palace, one written not in ink but in silence. It began with the Devçirme, the infamous levy that tore Christian boys from their families to serve as janissaries, molded into loyal instruments of Ottoman will. But what the historians seldom mention is that a parallel practice, far more secret and far more intimate, developed in the shadows of that same ideology, a taking not of sons, but of daughters. The women of faith, the nuns of distant monasteries, and the daughters of defeated lords were not merely spoils of war. They were the empire's living trophies, symbols of submission that could be remade in flesh and obedience. Letters from Venetian envoys spoke cautiously of this system, though none dared name it outright. In coded reports to the Doge, they wrote of white-veiled captives seen entering the palace at dusk, of processions where women walked with their eyes lowered and their rosaries cut from their wrists. Jesuit records from Smyrna hinted that entire convents had vanished overnight, their abbesses sent eastward under the guise of negotiation. Even in Rome, whispers reached the ears of the papal courts, though no banner was ever raised for their rescue. For in the politics of empire, the suffering of women was a currency too cheap to purchase outrage. Within the Ottoman worldview, the absorption of the conquered into the fabric of the state was both punishment and purification. A nun who had devoted her life to chastity was considered the perfect vessel through which to demonstrate the empire's supremacy over Christian virtue. To possess such a woman was to possess the symbol of the cross itself. But the Ottomans understood spectacle as deeply as they understood theology. The act was never merely personal, it was ceremonial, performed within the architecture of power, beneath domes painted with Quranic verses and walls hung with Persian silk. Each ritual of degradation served a dual purpose, the gratification of dominion and the erasure of identity. The transformation of captured nuns followed a sequence that combined bureaucratic precision with spiritual desecration. Upon arrival in the palace or provincial court, the women were stripped of their habits and given new garments of silk and musk, a gesture that pretended to honor but in truth unmade them. Their Christian names were replaced with Turkish or Arabic ones, chosen not for meaning but for sound, for how easily they rolled off the tongue of command. Their hair was perfumed, their skin bathed, and their prayers replaced with recitations they did not understand. For some, resistance ended there. For others, the body fought long after the faith began to crumble. The empire had learned long ago that pain could be resisted, but the slow intoxication of luxury, the suffocating kindness of captivity, could reshape even the devout. In time, these women disappeared into the folds of the empire's myth. Some became concubines in distant pashas' courts, others were confined within the White Chambers, rooms reserved for the sultan's private ceremonies. The most docile were absorbed into the inner service of the palace, tending to the harems that had once been their nightmares. The few who survived long enough to escape left behind testimonies so fragmented that historians dismissed them as hysteria. Yet between their trembling words, a pattern emerges, of ritualized humiliation cloaked in the language of civilization, of faith reforged into ornament. What made this system so insidious was not merely the suffering it inflicted, but the order with which it was carried out. The Ottomans prided themselves on being custodians of discipline and refinement. They catalogued even their cruelty. Registers were kept of the women taken, the names they were given, the households they were assigned to. In these records, a nun was no longer a person, but an entry, a mark beneath the seal of empire, another quiet victory in its unending war against defiance. And yet, the empire's chroniclers, brilliant as they were, never wrote of these women. The architects of history erased them, just as the empire had erased their faith. The silence was deliberate, because to speak of them was to reveal that beneath the grandeur of domes and calligraphy, the empire's sanctity was built upon desecration. For centuries, their voices have remained buried beneath the marble, their names reduced to dust in the archives of forgotten monasteries. But traces survive in letters smuggled through the Adriatic, in confessions whispered behind cloistered doors, in the songs of pilgrims who swore they heard weeping in the ruins of old convents. It is through these faint echoes that we can glimpse the truth, that the Ottoman Empire's conquest was not confined to the battlefield or the city walls. It reached into the sanctum of faith itself, turning devotion into spectacle, sanctity into submission, and belief into servitude. And for those who wore the veil of Christ, the conquest did not end with defeat. It began with it. What awaited them behind the golden doors of Topkapi would not be salvation, but transformation, and every step they took within that perfumed labyrinth drew them further from the light of the God they once served. It began not with thunder or triumph, but with the dull hum of inevitability that accompanies every empire's appetite. Along the edges of the Balkan hills and the crumbling coasts of the Aegean, the Ottoman horsemen came like a tide that neither raged nor shouted, for conquest had by now become a profession, not an event. They moved beneath banners that shimmered with verses promising divine favor, and when their drums ceased, silence became more terrifying than war itself. Inside remote convents tucked among cypress groves, Women of faith listened to that silence grow. It was a silence that pressed through the walls, through prayer, through the fragile certainty that God still watched. When the gates finally splintered, it was not the noise that broke them, but the realization that holiness had no defense. The soldiers did not kill those who knelt, they bound them instead. They gathered their captives with the precision of men collecting tribute, each woman another coin in a treasure that could not be counted aloud. The smell of burning wax, of crushed lilies from the altar, of horse sweat and smoke, all fused into a single suffocating perfume that marked the moment the sacred turned profane. For the nuns, capture was the first death, and yet it was only the prelude to a slower, more deliberate unmaking. The marches that followed became their purgatory on earth. Chained in small groups, heads shrouded to shield them from the sun and from pity, they were led through villages where laughter replaced compassion. Markets that once sold grain now displayed captives. Children whispered that the white-veiled women were witches who had angered their god. Merchants spat in mock blessing. The empire understood spectacle as deeply as it understood faith. Each procession was theater, designed to teach both the conqueror and the conquered who now held dominion. Along the dusty roads, the nuns recited prayers that melted into the wind, their Latin syllables colliding with the guttural calls of their guards, creating a music that belonged to no tongue. Nights brought neither rest nor dignity, only the weight of exhaustion, the soreness of wrists rubbed raw by rope, and the eerie gentleness of guards who offered water as though pity itself were a performance. Some captives whispered that if they could reach the capital, mercy might await, but the older sisters knew that mercy was a word the empire had translated out of existence. When they entered Constantinople, now reborn as Istanbul, the city greeted them like a mirage of contradictions. Minarets pierced the heavens with grace, and the air shimmered with the fragrance of rosewater and iron. In the shadow of its domes, the captives were paraded before officials who recorded their origins as one might inventory spices: 1 from Rhodes, 2 from Thessalonica, 5 from Ragusa, 7 from the convent near Izmir. The ledgers did not mention their vows, only their age and complexion, as though the empire were cataloging shades of surrender. From the palace harbor, they were distributed to waiting carriages bound for the inner quarters. There, behind marble walls veined with gold, began the next phase of their transformation, the process that turned faith into obedience. In the training chambers of the palace, they were stripped not with violence, but with ritual. Their habits were burned in braziers perfumed with myrrh so that the scent of their past might never cling to them again. They were bathed in rose water until their skin glowed, and the attendants, silent as ghosts, combed their hair while reciting verses they could not understand. Each gesture was calculated, each kindness designed to erode the memory of defiance. Their crucifixes were taken not as theft but as exchange, for each cross, a bracelet of gold, for each vow, a new name whispered against the ear in the language of power. To refuse was to invite isolation in the marble cells known as the rooms of silence, where the absence of sound gnawed at sanity more cruelly than whips ever could. Many yielded simply to hear a human voice again. In time, they began to forget their old prayers, not because they wished to, but because memory itself became dangerous. Each remembered word a spark that could betray them to the watchful eunuchs who patrolled the halls like priests of another god. Once reshaped, they were brought before the lattice screens of the inner court, the harem where hierarchy ruled more strictly than scripture. Some would serve in the baths, where steam blurred the line between service and surveillance. Others would sing or play instruments taught by tutors who smiled too softly to be trusted. The empire demanded not love but perfection, an artful choreography of submission that transformed even suffering into grace. The nuns learned quickly that tears were forbidden, only silence was rewarded. In that silence, a strange metamorphosis began. They ceased to think of themselves as captives and began to exist as reflections, mirrors that existed only to flatter the gaze of their masters. The longer they remained, the less they remembered the texture of linen veils, the taste of the Eucharist, the resonance of bells at dawn. Their faith dissolved not through torture, but through repetition, the daily bow, the endless lessons in poise, the careful re-education of posture and smile. One might say they were broken, the truth is subtler. They were rewritten. The empire's cruelty reached its purest expression in what the chroniclers never dared describe, the ceremonies of the White Chambers. Here, beneath vaults painted with celestial blue and verses from the Quran, the most prized captives were presented in veiled processions, lit by hundreds of lamps. Music drifted through the corridors, Persian melodies slow enough to mimic breathing, and incense filled the lungs until consciousness itself seemed perfumed. The ritual was one of inversion. The nuns who had once married their souls to heaven were now symbolically wed to power. Their silence was taken as consent, their trembling as devotion. The attendants recited prayers of blessing, but no one could tell whether those words were meant for the sultan, for the women, or for the empire itself. To survive these ceremonies was to become unrecognizable, for the body endured what the soul could no longer name. Those who emerged alive were adorned with jewels and placed among the sultan's attendants, living testaments to the empire's dominion over both heaven and earth. Those who could not endure were never mentioned again, and yet not all submission produced peace. A few among them clung to the remnants of their identity, like shards of glass hidden within silk. They met in secret, in the quietest corners of the baths or near the lattice windows overlooking the Bosporus, whispering fragments of psalms that survived only as rhythm, not language. These fragments became their resistance, their last act of rebellion against a world that demanded beauty in exchange for silence. One tale tells of Sister Magdalena, who carved a tiny cross beneath the marble basin of the royal bath, using the edge of a gemstone gifted to her by her captor. It was said that when the baths were cleaned each month, no one dared scrub that corner, for every servant felt an inexplicable chill upon touching it. Perhaps it was imagination. Perhaps the empire itself, for all its might, still feared ghosts. Those who managed to escape the palace often found no redemption beyond its gates. The world outside no longer recognized them as holy. To the priests, they were defiled. To the townsfolk, they were rumors. Some wandered through Anatolia disguised as beggars, whispering confessions to strangers in dialects that had died with their convents. Others crossed into Venetian or Genoese ports and took vows of silence in foreign monasteries, choosing obscurity over memory. But even in their silence, the past pursued them. They dreamed of the palace lights reflected on polished floors, of the sound of slippers gliding behind veils, of prayers recited in two languages that neither could save them. The body remembered what the soul tried to bury, and so they lived as living palimpsests, manuscripts written over but never erased. Within the empire, their absence created myths. Poets spoke of mysterious women who appeared in the sultan's dreams, draped in white, weeping without sound. Court historians dismissed such visions as superstition, yet the superstition spread, for it served a purpose. It softened the cruelty of truth. The official story claimed these women had embraced Islam willingly, drawn by the radiance of divine truth. To question that narrative was to question the empire itself, and so silence became scripture. In the archives of Topkapi, their names were reduced to initials, their origins obscured by ink that faded more quickly than the paper it stained. Yet the pattern of disappearance spoke louder than any confession. Dozens of convents vanished across the Balkans and the Levant during the height of Ottoman power, leaving behind no bodies, no graves, only the faint echo of bells that rang once and were never heard again. As decades passed, the system evolved into something even colder. The empire no longer needed to raid convents. Now the conquered offered their daughters willingly, believing it would grant favor or safety. What began as coercion matured into complicity, and thus the cruelty became invisible. The daughters of priests and nobles entered the palace as tributes of peace, educated in the arts of courtesy and silence. Some even grew proud of their positions, wearing their new names like armor against the memory of their birth. In this way, the empire achieved what no sword could, the transformation of conquest into culture. The faith that had once resisted was now woven into the empire's fabric, its defiance neutralized by luxury. And yet, beneath the surface of that glittering civilization, the ghosts of the first captives lingered. Their story passed in secret through the servants' corridors, whispered by midwives and bath attendants, carried in lullabies sung to the children of the court. "Beware the woman in white," they sang, "for she prays to a god who never forgave." The palace tolerated these whispers because even fear served the throne. But for those who knew the truth, the eunuchs who had escorted the captives, the scribes who had entered their names into ledgers. The legend was no comfort. They had witnessed something the empire itself dared not remember, that every empire that prides itself on mercy eventually builds its paradise upon the bones of those it calls blessed. Thus the tale of the Christian nuns did not end in blood, but in erasure, and erasure was the empire's most refined cruelty. To kill a person is to invite remembrance, but to unmake her until she is no longer herself is to destroy even the possibility of history. That was the genius of Ottoman dominion. Its violence was wrapped in silk, its desecrations perfumed, its victims taught to smile through ruin. Each captive became both servant and monument, her silence a column supporting the illusion of civilization. The harem, admired by travelers as the garden of beauty and order, was in truth a cemetery of souls where the living were embalmed in ritual, their faiths dissected and rearranged to suit the symmetry of imperial desire. And in the end, when the empire's poets celebrated love, harmony, and divine unity, their verses echoed the same paradox that had consumed those women. That beauty, in the empire's tongue, was only another word for control, and that the most exquisite obedience is born from despair. For centuries, the Ottomans mastered the art of making cruelty look like order. And it was within that exquisite symmetry that the darkest truth hid, one so meticulously arranged that even historians mistook it for civility. The empire had long ceased to think of its acts as crimes or sins. It had transformed its own brutality into ritual, bureaucracy, and belief. Every chamber, every ceremony, every silence served a higher geometry of control. Within the vaulted halls of Topkapi, scribes bent over parchment not to record glory, but to catalogue obedience. They listed the names of the women taken from the conquered lands, marked their conversions, their usefulness, their offspring, and their deaths, and these records were kept in the same archive as military campaigns and treaties. To the empire, there was no difference between a conquered city and a conquered soul. Both were evidence of divine order fulfilled. Even cruelty was domesticated, translated into the language of administration, stamped and sealed as destiny. In these ledgers, one can still find the faint traces of that machinery, the neat rows of calligraphy recording human lives as though they were fabric or spice, their worth measured in beauty, their death described as expiration of service. It was not chaos that destroyed them, it was discipline. In the Sultan's doctrine, the conquest of faith was not an act of blasphemy, but of purification. The empire saw itself as the forge through which all impurities were burned away, leaving only submission gleaming at the core. And so, the nuns who had once been brides of Christ were recast as brides of empire, their purity rebranded as proof that even holiness must kneel before sovereignty. The Sultan's scholars justified this transformation through the language of divine hierarchy, arguing that if God had allowed their defeat, then their new servitude was His will. Under such logic, the empire's cruelty became virtue, its desecration became order, and every prayer uttered in resistance became evidence of disobedience against heaven. The beauty of this lie was that it required no violence to sustain itself. Faith itself became the weapon. The women, taught that obedience was sanctity, soon learned to bless their own chains, and thus the empire's greatest conquest was not of land or body, but of conscience. Yet beneath that theological elegance lay a more disturbing truth. The empire had discovered that by reshaping the identity of its victims, it could create generations loyal not by force, but by lineage. Many of the children born from those converted women were raised within the palace walls, educated in both the languages of their mothers and the doctrines of their fathers, serving as translators, scribes, or envoys between the empire and the Christian realms that feared it. They became living symbols of reconciliation, but their existence was the empire's most refined cruelty, a silent reminder that even blood could be conquered. The sons of violated faiths wore silks and titles, the daughters sang before the courts, and in their faces one could see the vanishing trace of a cross that no longer had a name. Through them, the empire achieved immortality. It turned violation into lineage, and lineage into legitimacy. And because these children were taught to revere the Sultan as both ruler and redeemer, they grew into loyal servants who preserved the very system that had erased their origin. The cycle became perfect. The victims bore the heirs of the machinery that had enslaved them. It is here that history shudders, for the empire's genius lay not in cruelty alone, but in its ability to make cruelty invisible. The chroniclers of Europe who visited the Ottoman court were dazzled by its sophistication, the order of its ceremonies, the glitter of its etiquette, the haunting beauty of its women behind latticed screens. None of them wrote of the horror they glimpsed in those lowered eyes. They mistook silence for serenity, composure for contentment, and because the empire wrapped its darkness in gold, the world applauded its magnificence. Venetian diplomats sent home descriptions of the Sultan's generosity, of the harmonious order of his harem, never realizing that the harmony was built on the annihilation of voice. The archives of the Vatican contain letters from priests who begged for permission to ransom captives, yet were instructed to remain silent to avoid diplomatic strain. Even faith, when faced with power, chose discretion over compassion. Thus, the greatest conspiracy was not in what the empire did, but in how the world allowed it to be forgotten. And though centuries have passed, fragments of those hidden records still surface, bearing the chill of bureaucratic cruelty. In one faded document written in Ottoman Turkish, a scribe records the transfer of 8 veiled captives from Smyrna to the imperial household for assimilation. No description of their fate follows, no word of protest, only the seal of approval and the notation that the transfer was completed without resistance. Another letter, preserved in the archives of Venice, describes a traveler's account of hearing hymns sung in Greek from within a closed courtyard near the Seraglio gate. Hymns that stopped abruptly whenever footsteps approached. These are the ghosts that haunt the margins of history, faint, factual, almost polite, but heavy with the knowledge of what politeness conceals. The horror was never in the spectacle of pain, but in its quietness, in the way the empire turned even agony into routine. The deepest cruelty of all, however, lay in how the empire taught its victims to participate in their own disappearance. Over time, those who had survived longest became instructors to the newer captives, teaching them how to walk, how to speak, how to serve, how to forget. They repeated the same phrases of consolation that had once been used against them. Submission is peace. Obedience is protection. Silence is survival, until the words lost their venom and became law. The transformation was complete when a former nun, now a palace tutor, instructed her pupils in etiquette, unaware that her lessons were the empire's echo speaking through her. It was this cycle that ensured the longevity of Ottoman domination. Its victims became its most effective guardians. Even centuries later, the traces of this logic persist wherever power disguises subjugation as virtue, wherever civilization decorates its cages with beauty and calls them palaces. Historians have long debated why these accounts were suppressed, why church records grew vague and travelers' journals evasive. The answer is neither mystery nor conspiracy. It is shame. To acknowledge the truth would have meant admitting that Christendom, with all its crusades and cathedrals, had failed to protect its most devoted servants. It was easier to bury their story beneath politics and diplomacy than to face the mirror of guilt. And so, for generations, the silence endured, not only in Istanbul but in Rome, Venice, and Vienna. Every nation that traded with the empire became complicit. Every scholar who praised its architecture helped polish the marble that covered its graves. The silence was global, and in that silence, the empire's ghosts learned to sleep standing. The final revelation, the one that chills most deeply, is that the Ottoman conquest of the spirit never truly ended. When the empire finally fell in the 20th century, its palaces became museums, its archives national treasures, its harems subjects of fascination and romance. Tourists now walk through those same corridors where prayers once turned to sobs, photographing the painted ceilings and calling them beautiful. The walls do not protest, they have learned the same lesson their builders taught, to speak through silence. But if one listens long enough, one can almost hear it still, the faint echo of a hymn cut short, the rhythm of breath held in fear, the whisper of a name that was forbidden to be spoken. These are not relics, they are confessions in stone. And so, the empire's darkest legacy is not merely in what it did to those women, but in how perfectly it concealed it. Its cruelty was not an outburst of barbarism but a system of theology and law, a machinery so elegant that even its victims came to believe it sacred. To the Ottomans, mercy meant assimilation, and redemption meant erasure. The women who once defied empire with prayer were transformed into its ornaments, their silence enshrined as virtue. Historians may call this power, but the truth is simpler and more horrifying. It was worship inverted, faith devoured by empire, holiness consumed by the very order it had sought to resist. What the Ottomans did with those Christian nuns was worse than death, not because it ended life, but because it unmade it, turning the sacred into shadow and ensuring that even centuries later, the world would call that shadow beautiful. Time has buried the empire, but not its echo. The domes of Istanbul still gleam beneath the same sun that once burned upon those veiled processions, and the marble of Topkapi still glows warm beneath the touch of strangers who do not know what it remembers. Empires die, but their methods of forgetting do not. The walls that once heard the broken prayers of nuns now listen to the chatter of tourists. The fountains that once washed away tears now glisten beneath camera flashes. And every courtyard that once served as a stage for submission has been renamed, rebranded, refined into heritage. Yet beneath the polish, the stones hold their breath. They know what was bought to make this beauty possible. They know how many souls were traded for silence. History calls it the Age of Glory, but the stones whisper otherwise. They whisper that the empire's grandeur was never built by architects alone. It was mortared with erased confessions, consecrated with obedience, and perfumed with the suffering of those who were told their pain was holy. Centuries later, their names are gone, but the pattern remains. Wherever faith and power intertwine, the same alchemy reappears. Mercy dressed as control, salvation repackaged as servitude, beauty offered as atonement for cruelty. The faces change, the languages shift, the costumes evolve, but the choreography is identical. There are still empires that demand silence from the devout, still systems that turn women's faith into spectacle, still chambers where prayers are currency and submission is praised as peace. To study what the Ottomans did is not to gaze into a relic of barbarity. It is to stare into a mirror that refuses to age. For every civilization that calls itself enlightened eventually discovers its own version of the harem, a place where the holy is repurposed, where virtue is reshaped to flatter power, where conscience is bent until it becomes decor. The Ottomans were not monsters. They were masters of a principle that survives all thrones, that control feels most divine when it disguises itself as love. And perhaps that is why the story of those nuns still haunts us. It is not their suffering alone that chills the blood, but the precision with which their erasure was justified. They remind us that evil rarely announces itself with screams. It enters softly, speaking the language of harmony, beauty, and faith. They remind us that death is not the only form of destruction. There is a deeper annihilation that comes when memory itself is taught to bow. Somewhere, beyond history's reach, they remain. The women in white who vanished into the empire's shadow, whose silence became its foundation, whose endurance became its curse. Tell me then, what is truly worse? To die for what you believe, or to live long enough to become the proof that belief itself can be rewritten? The empire may have fallen, but its lesson endures, that the darkest power is not the sword that kills, but the hand that teaches the conquered to bless their conqueror. If this journey through forbidden history unsettled you, remember, it was meant to. For only by confronting what was done in the name of civilization can we see how close we still stand to the edge of that same abyss. Subscribe, if you dare, for more truths the world tried to bury.